But thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Best-selling authors Scott Turow and Alafair Burke will discuss their newest thrillers, Presumed Guilty and The Note, in conversation with Dwyer Murphy, editor-in-chief of CrimeReads, in this installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So Scott, a writer and former practicing lawyer, is the author of 13 best-selling works of fiction, including Presumed Innocent and most recently Suspect. He has also published 2 nonfiction books, including 1L, about his experience as a law student. His books have been translated into more than 40 languages, sold more than 30 million copies worldwide, and have been adapted into movies and TV projects, including Apple TV Plus' Presumed Innocent series. Scott has frequently contributed essays and op-ed pieces to publications such as the New York Times, Washington Post, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, and The Atlantic. So Alafair Burke is the Edgar-nominated New York Times best-selling author of 14 novels of suspense, including The Ex, The Wife, The Better Sister, and Find Me, as well as co-author of the best-selling Under Suspicion series. A former prosecutor, she is now a professor of criminal law. She recently served as president of the Mystery Writers of America and was the first woman of color to be elected to that position. And she lives in New York. And finally, Dwyer Murphy, our facilitator, our conversationist partner tonight, is the author of The Stolen Coast, as well as An Honest Living, both of which were New York Times Editor's Choice selections. His newest novel, The House on Buzzards Bay, will be released in June 2025 from Viking. He is the editor-in-chief of CrimeReads and was previously a New York-based litigator, although I did just learn he is a Massachusetts native. So everyone, let's please give a big virtual round of applause to our guests tonight. And Dwyer, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having us, and hello to everyone in Massachusetts. I wanted to start the conversation tonight because as we just went through the introductions, there's kind of an obvious point of intersection here where the law and legal careers come into
Lawyers, yeah.
both of your novels. And I wanted to ask, because I'm somebody who found I immediately could not balance a legal career with a writing one and just got out of the law as quickly as I could. But both of you chose to pursue practicing in some instances, academia, working government service. So tell me, if you don't mind, maybe I'll start with you, Alafair. How did you decide to continue your legal career as you were writing, and how does that work? I want to know, please.
Well, I was a lawyer, and only a lawyer. I was not dreaming of writing a book. My father's a writer, and I think because he always told me, "You're going to be a writer." My form of rebellion in my house was to become a lawyer. But I was pretty serious about it. I clerked for a year for a federal judge. I went to a DA's office, and kind of planned on being a lifer, I think. But I was a consumer of novels, especially crime novels. Just constantly, inhaling these books. And one of the things I noticed is that not all lawyers, but particularly a prosecutor, when a prosecutor would show up on the page, like you could just skip the next 5 pages because for the most part, it's like objection, hearsay, you need a warrant, like a lot of prosecutors, when they show up in most people's books, it's to provide exposition, right? Somebody who's a pain in your butt, or a lot of technical detail. And at the time, I was working in a precinct, out of a precinct as a DA, as a legal advisor, and as a court, community-based prosecutor. But in any event, I saw all these discretionary things that prosecutors do behind the scenes. Most of their work is not in the courthouse, and it's not where the interesting stuff really happens. It's in the hallways. It's the phone calls you're making. You hear police officers talk to prosecutors so differently than they talk in court, which is different than how they talk to each other. And so I kind of felt like I had an insider's look to a really rich world that you don't see written about a lot, except for books like Presumed Innocent, which is such a great depiction of a prosecutor's office. And so I became one of those annoying lawyers who was like, one of these days I'm going to write a book. And I thought it would just be one book. And by then I was a law professor. And I remember sheepishly telling my dean, like, your newest hire just wrote a mystery novel. But they want me to write a second one. And I thought he was going to say no. And he was like, are you kidding? That's totally cool. Keep doing it. And so I was able to balance both. So I'm still at the law school. I only teach one semester now. So that's kind of a great balance for me, but I still like being part of the law. And I think, Scott, you kept like you stayed in it the whole time, right?
Yeah, well, I retired in 2020, although I still have one pro bono case, which rarely does a day pass that I don't do something on it. So, but it will end someday. I'm assured. Um, for me, um, it was more on the order, Dwyer, of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I remember, I had um, sold Presumed Innocent to Ferris Strauss, and Raj Strauss, who was uh, really the publisher at that point. I don't, his father probably had the title, but Raj was really doing the work. Roger, the son of, and he flew out to Chicago just to meet me, which I thought was pretty cool. And as we're in the taxi going back from lunch, uh, he says to me, promise me one thing. And I said, what? He says, you won't stop practicing law. Don't make any changes for a while. See how it all goes. And I don't think I needed his encouragement because for me, my years, I'd been a writing fellow at Stanford, and then I had taught there for 3 years before I went to law school. And those were really hard years for me. And so there was kind of an anxiety about being only an author. And for whatever reason, law school and the law had really nurtured my writing. So, but I still thought, there were, at that point when Raj came to see me, I'd just gone into private practice. And I was curious. I was curious about civil litigation. I was curious about being a defense lawyer. I'd already tried my first case in private practice at the time Raj showed up. Um, and, I liked it. If you can contain and cabin law practice, which is a very hard thing to do, um, it I've always found that it added to my life. Now, eventually it got out of control. I had a summer where I tried 5 cases. And why this should have been the pivotal event, I don't know. But I was doing a big arbitration on a defense system, so it was in secret. Um, and one of the lawyers on the other side walked in and he said, I just saw the paperback of Presumed Innocent on sale downstairs, on one of these drugstore racks. And I just had this period where I'd get up every morning and all I knew was that I was on trial. And I figured by the time I had shaved, I'd remember which case. And that moment, I said, something's got to give. And I came back from that trip. I was in Kansas City at the time. And I just went to my closest friend in the firm who brought me in. And I said, I got to figure something out, Dwayne. And originally I went to 3/4 time. By the time I got to 2020, um, if I billed 10 hours in a week, it was a lot. Um, so, but the one thing I had going for me um, was that I made no secret from my clients that I was home in the morning writing, and I counted on them to be respectful of that fact. And the ones who were just violated that sort of my trust in them willy-nilly got passed on to somebody else. But when they called, for the most part, they really had something that needed to be dealt with then. And the one gift I had is that the phone could ring, I could be in the middle of a sentence and I could talk for 40 minutes, and then write the follow-up emails I had to write, and then go right back into that sentence. And I know that that's hard for a lot of other people to do. It may prove that I'm basically schizophrenic, but I could just get back on the horse and ride off.
I can't imagine finding the time, especially earlier in your career. I don't know. I just remember feeling that when you're starting out as a lawyer, it sort of rewires your brain, right? You have to learn to think
Yes.
very specific ways, and they don't always seem conducive. But it sounds like both of you got some juice out of your legal careers, that it worked. You found a balance.
I really do think in my case, the fact that I'd had those 5 years in California where I'd been at Stanford, which is where Alafair and I met some years ago, because she's a graduate of that law school. Um, I, I think the fact that I had lived and worked as a writer made a huge amount of difference when I started practicing, because I sort of developed that persona and those habits, and I could just slide back into it when I had the time to do it.
That makes so much sense because I started my first novel while I was in practice, but it wasn't for a lack of time. I didn't have the kind of job that I was working till midnight or anything. It was just I was mentally exhausted when I got home. I just wanted to eat dinner and watch Seinfeld and go to bed. I couldn't find that energy to write. I think now that I'm a law professor, my hours aren't as grueling. It's not as stressful, but I teach classes and I write about the law, so I'm kind of exercising those muscles as a writer. It's just two different kinds of projects. But I still find it difficult to go back and forth. Like for fiction, I kind of want, a big block of uninterrupted time to kind of lose myself into it. So I'm impressed that you could stop and think about a client and go back in.
And I did that throughout my career. I would write, um, if I could restrict it, I would, save the afternoon for law practice. But if I couldn't, it wasn't that big a deal. And then, of course, when you're on trial, when you're headed for trial, um, you both know this. Then everything gets pushed out of the way. I didn't do a great job as a father in those periods because trying cases is so consuming. So, writing was definitely not going to take place, and I knew that.
Scott, with those clients and maybe opposing counsel, or people especially as your reputation grew, did people think that you were going to turn them into fiction? Did that, was that part of the understanding when you took on a client that maybe their quirks would show up in 10 years in a novel?
I'm sure that kept some clients away.
Yeah.
It probably brought a few through the door who thought it would be, wonderful if I would, turn them into a saint of some kind in my next written project, because not all of my clients were ready to be canonized. But I had enough to do that I didn't worry about who wasn't showing up at my door. And when I was practicing in terms of judges, that was relatively easy because I'd been in AUSA, and I was already known in that courthouse. The people who were coming on the bench half the time are former AUSAs. So that wasn't all that difficult. People took me seriously when I showed up. But when I was in courtrooms elsewhere, that was more difficult. Um, and I remember one or two occasions when I called a client and said, "This is not going to work because this judge is just determined to prove to me that, and it was always a guy that, he's he's smarter and more important than I am, and I'm not the right lawyer for this case." But generally, that was not a problem. Occasionally, I had people on the other side who thought it was going to be neat to hang my scalp on their wall because, they could write below it, famous novelist. And I will say one other thing, and that is that um, it was it was always fun for me to say in a reply brief to the lawyer who wrote, Mr. Turow, a noted author of fiction, has written some more, was always fun to be able to say that is not an original line when I, either called up or found a place for it in my reply.
Alafair, you said something a moment ago that just came to me again as Scott was describing dealing with AUSAs and judges. You had said something about how you always just got bored when a prosecutor showed up in the
Not
novel.
always, but
Not with Scott, not with Scott.
oftentimes, yeah,
We're all making exceptions for presumed innocence. You can't have a
yeah.
pulse and be
Yeah, but he
bored.
also had him charged with murder, which is not your,
Right.
it's not,
But I am curious
yeah.
because both of you have sort of used different types of legal characters, and I wondered if there is a certain kind of lawyer that you find works well for your fiction or that sort of fires your imagination, whether it's a prosecutor, a defense attorney, or somebody that has just that particular role within the legal system has worked well for you as a novelist. I was curious, Alifair, because you've had a few different kinds of legal people show up, you know?
Yeah, and I like to think that they're all different, but I mean, I'm drawn to characters, whether they're lawyers or not, though. Particularly my lawyer characters are, they probably are all they're cynical, but they want to not be. They want the
Right.
systems to work, and they do their best to work within them and to test the limits of it when they have to. And so I probably am sort of drawn to that in a character of somebody who's smart, but also kind of understands that, um, the formal law isn't necessarily what drives the system.
That's kind of why, I mean, maybe good espionage fiction can be so good, right? There's a certain type of cynical person working within the system that I think lends itself to smart thriller,
Yeah,
like a
kind of
John le Carre character or something.
knowing the angles.
Right. Scott, you did all sorts of, I mean, I know like even just one character like Rusty has been through six different, versions of his legal career now. Is there one that really worked for you? He's a mediator now. I don't think I've seen a mediator.
Well, if you'd stuck with it long enough, Dwyer, you would have watched your friends
Become
age
arbitrators. Yeah.
into those roles, especially the friends who, were judges, and many of them now are working as arbitrator and mediators, and
Yeah.
they always are happy to point out making much more money than they ever
Yeah.
made when they were on the bench. So, but but for me, uh, the last novel I published was called Suspect, and the protagonist was a female investigator, which, albeit attached to a lawyer's office. And somebody pointed out to me, a friend, that said, "I don't think you've ever had a hero who who wasn't a lawyer." And I thought about that, and I realized, wow, that's pretty much true. I mean, I've written parts of novels from the point of view of investigators, um, and but it's a rarer event for me, and I have to admit that I am one of those people who is. I shouldn't be ashamed to say this, I guess, given popular opinion, but I like lawyers. Um, I really do. I like hanging around with them. I like that crafty way they think that Alafair was talking about. And you were talking about Dwyer, that was sort of beaten into us in law school. And and I've also met some really extraordinary human beings in the practice of law, and I felt confident that I was going to continue to meet extraordinary people in the practice. And, I think I have.
I get such a kick out of hearing you talk about that too, because when I started law school, one of the things that I don't know if they still do this, but back when at Columbia, they sent us like a copy of 1L or told us to read 1L before we started that summer before. And so you were right there with me sort of at the formation of that weird process that they do at law schools and Alafair, you know this, but like you're changing the way students think. It's a 3-year process for that for a reason, because it really is a rewiring of the brain that has to happen for that. Um, but Alafair, I want to ask you this because last night you caused those pillow talk conversations you have with a spouse that just kind of they just keep going, and suddenly we're up for a
Okay.
half an hour debating things and we're both a little fired up. So the premise of your book caused one of those conversations
Oh
last night.
no.
So I just am gonna say it as correct me if there's a more succinct way of doing this, but a few women are on a vacation in the Hamptons. They're old friends. They're having a nice night out with drinks. Somebody had cut them off earlier for a parking spot, and they're sort of playfully conspiring about how they could get back at this guy in a way. And one of them makes the suggestion about dropping a note into the car because it was a man and a woman. They were on a date of some kind. And the note is just the most cutting, perfect note that you could write to destroy somebody's life, but in a playful way. They just say something like, he's having an affair.
He's
And
cheating. He always does.
cheating, right? Like, so they leave
He
it for the
always
woman to
does.
find.
Yeah.
And if you found that note, an anonymous note from somebody who's unmotivated to lie to you, it would be impossible to put that truth out of mind. You would believe it. I just like you would assume that it's true and things could spiral very quickly. But I think
Yeah.
my wife is the type of person who would actually leave that note. And that's how this conversation spiraled. But tell me about where this moment came from, because it has to be somewhere specific that
I
this.
have to tell the story. I hate telling the story. Like, why did I write this book? Because
I
now I have
know.
to tell the story because
I'm
I'm a
sorry.
sociopath. I wrote that note. I did not leave it on anyone's car. However, we were joking around, my friends and I. Somebody brazenly stole a parking spot that we had claimed. The turn signal was on, universal language. That's my real estate. And she swooped in front of us and actually did like smirk and wave. And we were like, oh, like, we just kind of kept talking about like, wow, she totally did that. But then my friend was kind of joking around and she wrote this very earnest note. She's very earnest. And it was like, that was very unkind of you. This was like right after the reopening after COVID. She's like, we've all been through so much and you saw us there and that was so unkind. And you should be more compassionate to people during a difficult time. I'm like, she's gonna ball that up, throw it on the ground. And then I wrote the mean note. And they were like, did you just think of that? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, you're a sociopath. And then the waitress got in on it and she started writing me notes and the people next to us started writing me notes. And so, but I couldn't stop thinking about, okay, what if you did do something like that in a fit of anger and it could spiral out of control because a woman who finds that note on the car is going to have something to say to her partner. And then what's he going to do? She's going to be looking at his phone. And anyway, these three women wind their nice weekend in the Hamptons
I honestly don't
gets
think that.
interrupted by a knock
Oh,
from the
yeah.
police.
That's not
then
sociopathic at
then
all.
things have to happen.
It
I
isn't
think my
sociopath. I know
my
you're joking,
rebuttal
but
is I'm
like,
a funny sociopath at least.
it isn't though. That's like a perfect understanding of human behavior. That's sort of the opposite of sociopathic, because
Yeah.
it's such a perfect note to mess with a couple, to mess with two people. That if you
And
receive
I
that note
managed to
in that
turn that
fashion,
stupid moment into a book. So yeah.
it's great.
'Cause with a thriller, you can never say what really happens. But in any event, the note gets them into a world of trouble and then things happen.
Okay, I won't spoil it for anyone else, but thank you for that. I enjoy it. It's because my wife and I were both lawyers, and
Well, the
so
police are
some of
leaving
that.
at the beginning of the book, so we know about
Right. It's
some of
early. That doesn't spoil anything for anyone.
Yes,
The
you
premise
know that
is,
the police wind up
I
around.
needed
Yes.
to know if you were the person who wrote that note, or somebody who could write that note. And apparently you are. I'm really impressed.
I'll do anything to make my friends laugh. It was just to make my friends laugh. So
Okay, wait, then quick follow-up on that. And I want to ask Scott the same thing. Are you the person that your friends would come to if they, I want to say, got caught up in a murder of some kind and they have to, are you the person that your friend group would look to if they were in really desperate circumstances? Because I'm kind of assuming, Scott, you are the person for your close friends that they would go to in that moment of crisis. But Alafair, are you? Because it sounds like maybe you have a different role in your friend group.
No, I think I'm still also the person that
Okay.
people look to for advice when they have a problem. I don't necessarily fix it for them, but I mean, I do think lawyers, what you're trained to do is to think through a problem and figure out how to fix it, right? Like, what's the smart thing to do here? Who do you need
Yeah,
on the
and
team?
that
What do
makes
you do
sense. I
first?
mean,
Yeah.
and Scott, you must be right. I've only met you twice virtually, and I would come to you if I killed somebody, I think.
Yeah, I think I would call Scott too.
Oh my. Um, I have to admit, nobody has ever called to tell me that they killed someone, and that would really take my breath away. You get older,
Accused. He would just be
Yeah,
accused. He
just
wouldn't have
accused,
actually done it.
falsely accused.
Yes.
your friends come sometimes and lay their problems on my table. Sure, and I put on my lawyer hat and try to figure out a way out of that, or at least who they ought to call next. Um, and almost always I tell them don't talk to the police. But yeah, I'm in that role often.
You have, I don't know, there's something comforting about your air. I think that you would calm me in a crisis, I think. But I want to ask you both a little bit about setting. Scott, I'll start with you because I read something in a profile of you a while back that said that the sort of this was in, I think it was GQ, and the subject of your body of work is the depravity of Midwestern professional class. And it was a good line, and it just had never occurred to me that you were a writer of the Midwest. I don't know why, but it just had not occurred to me somehow. I guess because I associated you closely with Kendall County and Chicago and cities in particular. But I'm wondering, the setting of presumed guilty is a very different place than Kendall County, and you've moved quite a bit into a different part of the Midwest. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you see the role of the setting in this new book and in your work generally a little.
Well, um, much like Alafair's story about how she came up with the sort of core event of the note. Um, I have had a house in rural Wisconsin for more than 30 years. And it was probably 5 or 6 years ago, I said to myself, um, there's not a lot of writing about rural America. And um, and that's probably not a good thing. And I just thought, that this is an interesting setting. It's not a city, um, and there's a lot that goes on, and and rural areas today have a lot of problems, and rural people these days feel resentful of the degree to which other Americans don't understand how difficult um, their their lives are, not just the people who are farming, but generally speaking, in most rural areas, there's not enough economic opportunity to keep the kids around. So you're sort of loving and raising your children and knowing that you're going to lose them in a way, um, and you're sending them off to somewhere else. And it was so I just thought that kind of setting where those realities are operating, would certainly be different for me. And So that was important when I began to think, of course, about the facts of this case. The idea of, a young African American male being on trial in a county where only 2% of the population is black, those difficulties became, became obvious. But I didn't start there.
And about as far a setting away from that as possible as I can imagine Alafair. Can you tell me about the Hamptons? How did that become the focus of the new book? And what is your experience of that place, and why did you want to capture it in this novel this
Yeah,
way?
I started visiting there more than 20 years ago, but my husband and I have lived primarily there for the last several years and call it home now. But um, you know, there's such a juxtaposition. People hear, even if you've never been to Eastern Long Island, people hear the Hamptons and have an idea of it. And the idea they have of it is associated with wealth and celebrity, fancy parties in the summer. And that's really not the place at all. It is a segment of the summer that everybody else tries to hide from, basically. And so I liked the idea of, these three people are basically outsiders to the Hamptons going and having a luxurious vacation and going to all the hot spots and having a fancy Airbnb. And then they get in trouble with this beef they have with some other outsider vacationing couple. And the police wind up paying attention to them. But the investigating police officer, who is a significant character, Carter Decker, he kind of represents the voice of the year-round, long-time community, right? And so there's a lot of things in the books that are contrasts, that nothing is quite as it seems. And so when you have these people coming in from East Hampton thinking that it's going to be safe and full of luxury, and instead some pretty dark things happen, I kind of liked the idea of being able to do that. And they're very much seen as outsiders by the local community, and they don't want to, for various reasons. All three women have faced public scandals in their past. It's kind of why they've reunited as friends. And so the last thing they want is people, eyeing them and talking about them. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, I have to say that the point in the book where I started going, well, I really like this, is when you said that all three of these women regard themselves as having been canceled.
Yeah.
Yeah, how did that come into the story? I'm curious too. That was a very striking decision.
Um, I don't even know which order things came in. I think I give a lot of thought to what social media is doing to us as a culture and as individuals. And I kind of felt like I had something to say about that. And I thought one way to do it is to have three women who have all been treated pretty negatively by complete strangers because of the media. And so I found three different angles to do that. Like, one of them gets talked about all the time on true crime message boards. Like, everybody's convinced she's a killer, basically. One of them got labeled a Karen after she had a very, very bad day on the subway. And then Lauren, who's an African American woman involved with a wealthy white boyfriend. Like, the media kind of turns her into a trope of like saying that, that she's slept her way up, or that, she got special favors. And these are three very, very successful women. Um, and they're serious people, and they get together and do this stupid thing. And and they just feel, it's like this inner paranoia of like, oh no, people are going to think we're bad again.
It was really well done, that air of paranoia that spreads between them. I found that very
Yeah,
effective.
thank you.
Uh, Scott, I wanted to ask you a bit about returning to this character who's kind of followed you through your career. And I'd read somewhere that you kind of acknowledged, maybe correct me if you don't think this is right, that Rusty's voice, the voice you use when you're writing a Rusty novel, is the closest to your own. And I wondered if that still feels accurate, and how it has evolved, and kind of how you find that voice again, because this is a new stage of his life, a new perspective, and coming back to him after, I think, like 15 years since the last novel, and more than that, obviously, since Presumed Innocent. But how did you find the process of getting back into Rusty's voice for this?
Well, I mean, I, we can try to make it mysterious and romantic, and say that, Rusty's voice is always inside me, which is, probably true for many characters. But how do you start? You sit down and read the other books you've written about this character. So, but I don't, I didn't find it very hard to go back to that voice, and it wasn't like I didn't need to fine tune it. It was just there. So, and I think Dwyer, without making any bones, it's exactly what I said. That voice is very close to my own. And I started, you know, sort of when I had this epiphanal moment in a courtroom while I was in AUSA, and I had all these arguments out at Stanford about, my view that an ideal novel could be read by an English professor and a bus driver. But I never really could figure out what that meant until I suddenly turned around and looked in a courtroom, and excuse me, I realized there's this incredible cross section of people who were in this courtroom watching what was a very minor case. And and I just had this eureka that crime is that subject that at least the one that I knew that would appeal, to a diverse array of human beings. So I started with, okay, I want to write about crime, and then was like, well, I better not, for obvious ethical reasons, write about the U.S. Attorney's Office or something. And I'd been through a little of this with 1L, and I didn't want to get close to this again. So I had worked as an intern in the Suffolk County DA's office, the Boston DA's office, and it had actually been a very dramatic time there. There was an election going on. And I those were the threads that I began pulling together. My boss in the Suffolk County DA's office was the chief deputy DA, a guy named Tim O'Neill. And Tim was and is a wonderful lawyer and went on to vast success as a plaintiff's lawyer. But what was distinctive about Tim, well, there were actually two things, one of which I didn't use. He was an Irish immigrant with, of course, just this fetching accent that he turned on in the courtroom. But the other was that he was a poet. And he went to a Cambridge bar called the Plough and the Stars, and occasionally he read there. And so what I said to myself at the beginning is, okay, what if my main character is somebody like Tim, who has, compared to the hard-boiled voice of Sam Spade, what if he's somebody with a more poetic voice and a more poetic soul, and is more in tune with his emotions, but as much as he thinks he's in tune with his emotions, and so that became the basic concept that he's not going to shy away from feeling in the way that the typical hard-boiled noir detective always has. And that's where Rusty's voice came from.
That explains a lot, I think, about him. And I'm curious, Alafair, to ask a similar question, how you found your way into the story for the note, specifically through May. I'm curious about that character and finding her voice and her perspective coming into this story, because it seemed to me such an apt way to approach this great concept that you had. But how did you find that voice?
She's a more exaggerated version of kind of all my inner anxieties. I mean, she puts a lot of pressure on herself. I mean, a lot of pressure on herself, and holds herself to really impossible standards. And she's half Asian, and I think a lot of Asian women in particular, and Asian men, like they're called the model minority, right? That you're not white, but at the same time, you don't necessarily have some of the same barriers to entry to careers like being a lawyer, for example. And she's somebody who just second guesses herself a lot, right? And she might be angry on the inside, but on the outside, she's always smiling and nodding and saying whatever you want, I'll do it, And like just one of the flashbacks in her career is that basically she gets told you're going to get passed over for partner or whatever, and she never tells anybody. Like it's still something she's never told anybody. Like it's this deep secret, and like that's how she winds up being a prosecutor. And she tells everybody it's because she wants to try more cases and have more control over her schedule and things like, like, and it's like this deep shame when it's lots of people don't make her partner, right? It's just like for her that's like this major failure, and she's a control freak. And I think, I was formulating this book kind of coming out of COVID, like, and during COVID. And it's just, I'm a control freak. And and I always think that I can handle any problem. And it turns out when the whole world shuts down, that's not a good time to be a control freak who thinks that you can solve every problem. And I think it broke her a little bit. So the book's not about COVID. It's set years after. It's like set in summer of 2023, I think. But she's still like her brain's still a little broken from it. And that's how she winds up having her Karen moment on the subway. And so the idea of taking a person like that in her current state of mind, like, and then putting her in the middle of the wrong side of a police investigation when she's always been, the good girl and the former prosecutor. I knew that was going to be an interesting setup to put her in.
Alafair, I want to stay with you for a moment because there was something else I wanted to ask about the Hamptons. And this was, as you're describing the place and telling a version of the Hamptons that isn't often told, and I didn't realize that you now, consider that your home. Is there any concern with writing about your home in this sort of provocative or
Yeah.
revelatory way?
I think I apologized to the police and the author note because the Hamptons is such a beautiful place with a very nice police department, and I keep killing people out there, or having people get kidnapped or whatever kinds of crimes. I think I've got 4 books set out there now, or set at least part out there, and I can't have the police be too good at their jobs, or it turns into a very different kind of book, right? So I kind of got to apologize. I have people who are born and bred from out there feel very strongly about like the pronunciation of certain things, and you call it this, not that. And a couple of my friends who, born and bred out there are early readers, and they'll flag something like, no, we don't call it the Marina, we call it this, or something like that.
Scott, were you working in Chicago and living in Chicago all the time of the Kindle County novels? Like, was there a period when you had to leave to keep doing it, or were you just there through all of it?
No, although oddly, I'm listening to all this. I'm actually, I moved down to Naples. Adrian and I came down here on a lark about, it's now 8 years ago. And we decided, we would stay, and we now live down here more than we lived back in the Midwest. And in one of my novels, The Last Trial, the main character is another of my recurring characters, Sandy Stern, who was Rusty's defense lawyer and presumed innocent, and passes by momentarily and presumed guilty. And but Sandy Stern hates Naples. He hates Florida, and he vents, about how it's, Florida's just this big prison colony for the elderly, and I had a hard time explaining to people when the book came out that he's a character, right? He's entitled to his point of view. There are plenty of people in the United States who feel the way Sandy feels, and I'm living here. I can't be the way I feel. So you can get in trouble writing about the place you live.
Yeah, and Florida has changed a bit in those years too. So I'm sure that those questions can get rather intense. I want to switch over to ask to I'm gonna scroll through some questions from the crowd, and you guys you don't need to look at them. I'll read them to you or digest them for you, and we can kind of go through some of these questions because it looks like we have some good ones. And the first one is for Scott, and one of our viewers looks like his name is John, wants to know about the proliferation of crime fiction and the interest in true crime since Presumed Innocent, and seeing the growth of that genre and how it strikes you that the evolution of crime fiction and maybe legal thrillers in particular through that period. Because I guess I'll add that you were, to some extent, you were an originator of a genre, but then, there was a huge growth of it during that period too. So we wonder what your perspective is on it.
I may have written Presumed Innocent, and I may have been first to the party in a certain way, but I didn't invent the interest, right? The interest was there, and LA Law was already on the air when I wrote Presumed Innocent, and it, what was happening, and I won't go on and for 40 minutes, but there were changes, I think, taking place in the country that were making the law even more prominent in terms of its effect on people's lives. And so they were curious about it. They were more curious than they'd been in years past. And so, you know, first my novel and then many people behind me were really, doing what Aristotle said, art's supposed to do. It's supposed to enlighten and entertain. But the enlightenment that people want, and this has always been true of popular fiction, going back to the 18th century, they want to learn something. You're doing them a favor, but it's something they actually want. They want to learn something, whether it's about life in the Hamptons or life in a courtroom. And so, the fact that true crime has blossomed is, again, I don't find it surprising, um, because people, they want what they regard as the truth. And, one thing they hold against journalists, I don't feel this way, but, that they're not really telling them the truth and they're supposed to be telling them the truth. And so they like true crime because it gets to the facts of real cases in a way that newspaper or social media won't deliver.
Um, the next question is from Sarah, and it's for Alafair. And the question, I'll just read it here, is: do you believe that being a woman and also a person of color has been a factor in your career, either positive or negative?
I don't know how to answer that because it's not like I have a control test for it, like where I got to have my career as a white man to see if it turned out differently. When I first became a lawyer, I mean, it wasn't that long ago. I was trying cases, I guess, in 95, is when I started trying cases. And at the DA's office, we were not allowed to wear pantsuits. We had to wear skirts because like a third of the judges thought lady lawyers aren't men. So we weren't supposed to dress like men. And I'm like, it's really cold outside. Like, I would like to wear pants. But, and there were judges like who made it very clear they didn't think we should be in there. And that was in the mid 90s. And, that's changed so much now. I think the majority of new lawyers are actually women at this point. So, you know, I'm not sure. Like I've seen it change. I'll say that. I've definitely seen the culture change for both people of color and women, particularly legal spaces. Yeah.
The pantsuit thing, that was still when I started practicing in 2008, and that was still part of the orientation at a big like white shoe firm in New York City was if you're going to be in court, you need to wear a skirt to the women. I
Yeah,
couldn't
I
believe
still
that was
remember my drawer full of pantyhose. Like you had to get all these, they came in those little eggs. And so
right,
you're constantly running your pantyhose. I'm like, oh, this is so stupid.
right. I remember
When
going
you're in
in,
trial, imagine
yeah,
Scott, you talked about how intense it is in trial. Like you don't even have time like to eat or like if you get one bathroom break a day, it's like you just go home dehydrated. And it's like, I'm like, really? I have to go change my pantyhose? This is the stupidest thing right now.
um, I'm going to seize back the questions for a moment because there was something I wanted to ask you, Scott, before, because I'll be remiss if I don't ask this because presumed innocent is now sort of a phenomenon again. And I know you've been through waves of this, that this isn't the first time your work has been adapted, but I do wonder if the timing the timing of a new novel coming out, it's obviously, it's good for your publisher. It's great that you've got the new adventures of Rusty coming right on the heels of Jake Gyllenhaal as Rusty. But I wondered if I imagine the book was already done, but I just wondered if the of your character being again part of the pop culture changes how you approach that character in any way. That's the question. I just want to know.
You know, um, Jake Gyllenhaal is, I don't know, what, 42, 43. And, my Rusty is aged as I've aged. So he's 77 when he's trying this case and presumed guilty. And um, so I wasn't trying to piggyback on the series, and I wasn't thinking much about it either. By the time I got to the set, most of this book was written. So, and you know, and it's presumed innocent is the Apple series was different enough from what I wrote that it wouldn't. I don't see how there would have been this intersection. It's certainly a nice happenstance for my publisher and me, that the Apple series was so popular, and here comes this book about the same character. But as I said, the character I'm writing about is not the character in the TV series. And I have to say that, David Kelly has optioned this book along with, Bad Robot and Warner Brothers, and he's strenuous about saying this is not going to be this is going to be more in the vein of my story, that it's not going to be a follow-on either to the Harrison Ford movie or the Jake Gyllenhaal series. It's going to be something else. And, I think David's idea is he may even change the character's name. So, it's, which that pleases me in many ways, that, he sees the book as a story in itself.
That's interesting to hear that that's how they might approach it. And Alafair, I wanted to ask you a version of the same thing because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but The Better Sister is maybe being developed now. And I wondered if, having any of your work sort of cross into a new form or a new media has affected the way you've approached the novels at all. I know that's a general way of asking it, but I'm quite curious how that maybe has affected your writing.
Yeah, so The Better Sister's done. It's in it'll be on Amazon. The date's not announced yet, but later this year. And it's 8 episodes in season one, starring Jessica Biel and Elizabeth Banks as the two sisters. I wasn't a producer, but I got the scripts, as they were being written, including the edits to them and, final, all that, every version of every script. So, when you take a novel, it'll just be interesting, Scott, like, as a 2-hour feature film, you've got to strip your book down, to its core, to get it to fit. And then with a multi-episode season, you can kind of build the world out, right, in ways like beyond the book. And so I knew that they'd be doing that, and the choices that they made, like how to build it out, because they kept the core of the book pretty true to it. For me, that was delightful to see. It's like somebody rolled with my characters and kind of created a bigger canvas for them. So I'm excited to see it. They did a good job from what I've seen.
And no changes because I know
But in terms of changing my books,
well, no, some writers are
so
like,
for me, it's not a series. Like I always, I know people who write series books that have been adapted into long running television shows, and so like even as a reader, I've noticed like when I read Bosch now, I do kind of picture Titus Welliver, and that's not how he used to look to me in my head, and like so it does kind of morph a little bit, and so if I were to write those characters again, I guess it would. Like who would I see as them? I still think of them as the book characters, but I think they were cast so true to it. But it's like for me, it's pretty close. So
I mean, I don't, when we get into this discussion, I'm always frank that film is such a powerful medium that when I started working on Innocent, which is the second of these three novels, even I saw Harrison Ford's face for a while before the character became my character again, and I saw him as I'd seen him originally. Um, and but I mean, for me, I've never tried to psych out Hollywood and figure out who's going to want to buy this or that. It happens, it happens. It's great. If it doesn't happen, that's not a knock on the book. And I've just tried to keep my distance from those expectations. And I always say to people, that town is full of executives who are trying to guess what the public wants and missing the mark more often than they hit it. So how in the hell am I supposed to do it? Sitting at home writing my book. I can't and I won't, and because I'd lose at that game.
You're being a bit modest. I think both of you have perfected some version of figuring out what the public wants and doing it. And I'll say this is my last note, but you both write novels that manage to entertain and be provocative and insightful and beautiful pieces of art too. So it's a real pleasure to get to talk with you both about them. And I think on that we'll wrap up the evening. So a reminder to readers that you now have at your disposal Scott Turow's Presumed Guilty and Alafair Burke's The Note. They're both available now. You can get them from a local bookstore or your wonderful library, as this is a real nice opportunity. I think I can speak for all of us to connect with library readers who we all started out, every author I think in imaginable started out as a devoted library reader, and so it's nice to be back with you all, and thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you to our authors and thank you to our hosts in Massachusetts. Really, this has been a treat. So we'll wrap it up there and say goodnight and hope everybody in Massachusetts tunes into the Celtics Lakers game at 10 o'clock. Go Celtics. And thank you again to everybody for joining us. Have a good night.
Thank you for being so
Thanks,
well.
Dwyer. Thanks, Scott.
Great
Thanks,
to-
everybody who was here. So fun.